Happy Douglas Week, everyone, and a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening to everyone, but also to the people joining us here on YouTube today. And thank you for being here with us on this first day of Douglas Week. My name is Dr. Caroline Dunham-Schroeder, and I'm the founder of Douglas Week. And I'm, as always, joined by my colleague, friend, and co-founder of the event series, Kristen Leary, as well as our guest speakers for this very special event. And this is actually our third annual Douglas Week. And like every year, we celebrate the great abolitionist and civil rights icon, and so much more, Frederick Douglass, as well as other historical and present-day change makers. This year, we are thrilled to be in Rochester, New York, where Douglass and his family lived for over 25 years. And we're absolutely delighted to be here, but also virtually around the world.
Yes, and each year, Douglas Week celebrates Frederick Douglass around the world, and we're grateful for our growing community of participants, presenters, and attendees who have been inspired to respond to the history of Douglass and others, and to share, collaborate, co-create, and provide personal and contemporary context through many different mediums.
Yeah, and in this second event of the day, we're very privileged to host a conversation in honor of the 50th anniversary of the Frederick Douglass Papers between three people with incredible insight and perspective on the history of the Papers project, from the project's early years, sort of getting started, to current work on the Yale print edition, to work on a new digital edition.
Yes, and the Frederick Douglass Papers collects, edits, and publishes the speeches, letters, autobiographies, and other writings of Frederick Douglass, both in books and online. The project's primary aim has been to make Douglass's surviving works accessible to a broad audience, much as similar projects have done for the papers of notable white historical and literary figures.
Yeah, and the project also includes the Frederick Douglass Papers digital edition, as Kristen said, offering more than 800 documents from the project's volumes. And this online resource will ultimately contain all of the content of the multi-volume Yale University Press print edition of Douglass's speeches, autobiographies, correspondences, other writings, and all of the unpublished correspondences, as well as other unpublished material, including editorial and speech tests.
And we're thrilled to be joined by our panel today to learn more about and to hear interesting and surprising stories around the documentation and curation of the Frederick Douglass Papers. This event is also a bit of a warm-up for a conference scheduled later this year to celebrate the 50th anniversary, and I know our panelists will provide information about that event as well. We're looking forward to that this fall. Again, thanks to all of you joining us today, and thank you to our panelists for being here. We're very happy to have you join us for what we know will be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, everyone. Really looking forward to the fall event. So this is a teaser event. And to everyone watching online from around the world, we hope that you enjoy this special event and that you tune in for more Douglas Week events this week, because we have more than 35 other events planned. So if you want to know more, take a look at our website, follow us on social media, and be live here with us on YouTube. And if you have any questions right now here for this panel, for our speakers today, please feel free to put them in the chat. It's here on YouTube, so you can just type it in the chat. And if there's time, our panelists are very happy to answer any questions. And now it's time to hand over to Professor Greenspan to start the conversation and to introduce our panelists. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Enjoy. Happy Douglas Week.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to this session on the 50th anniversary of the Frederick Douglass Papers. I'm Ezra Greenspan, and I have the pleasure of moderating our discussion of one of the longest-lived, most expertly, even devotedly, archived, edited, and disseminated set of papers in the field of African American and American history. The Frederick Douglass Papers project was founded at Yale University in 1973 under the direction of Professor John W. Blassingame, with the support of the National Historic Publications and Record Commission, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Ford and Rockefeller Commission. Those were the days. To date, the project has published 12 of a contemplated 15-volume scholarly edition, the 13th currently in press and about to appear in September, in 4 series of Douglass's speeches, autobiographies, correspondence, and journalistic writing. And to go from good to better yet, it's in the process of springboarding from print to electronic mediacy, which will make more of the supporting archive of the project, as well as the published volumes, universally available. We've organized our discussion in the following manner. We'll track speaker by speaker, from Larry Powell to Jack McKivigan to Sue Perdue, from the earliest days of the project to the present moment. Each will speak in turn for about 10 minutes, to be followed by a 10-minute period of interplay between panelists, as well as the speaker's response to questions from our listeners, which I'll intersperse into the conversation. And we'll repeat that procedure with our second and third speakers. Once we've completed that portion of our session, we'll open up the session to a more general conversation between speakers, as well as with our audience through questions and comments submitted to the chat portal. Our first speaker is Lawrence Powell, henceforth Larry, who is the James H. Clark Endowed Chair in American Civilization Emeritus at Tulane University, where he taught from 1978 until his retirement in 2012. From 2000 to 2005, he was director of the Tulane Xavier National Center for the Urban Community. From 2010 to 2012, he directed the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South at Tulane. His many books include, most recently, Troubled Memory, Anne Levy, The Holocaust in David Duke's Louisiana, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2000, and The Accidental City, Improvising New Orleans, published by Harvard in 2012. Among his honors, a Guggenheim Fellowship, naming in 1999 as Louisiana Humanist of the Year, election in 2008 as a fellow in the Society of American Historians, and service in the year 2014-15 as chair of the jury for the Pulitzer Prize in History. But most relevant for our purposes today, Larry was one of the earliest of the associate editors of the Frederick Douglass Papers at Yale University, going back to the 1970s, and an associate collaborator of the founding editor, Professor John W. Blassingame. He'll take us, I hope, as close as we're likely to get to the big boom of the editorial project. Larry, over to you.
Oh, I'm supposed to give you the Big Bang story. And, you know, I don't know if it's a supernova or a slow bird, but I met John in 1967 when he was finishing his dissertation. And he came down to work in the Booker T. Washington papers and edited by Lewis Harlan. This is at the University of Maryland. I was graduating and on my way to graduate school at Yale, and he was just finishing up at Yale. But a few years later, our paths intersected. We became good friends. And then one day, this has been 1972 or 73, when I was, the truth to tell, like not unusual in being a graduate student who floundered, and he kind of bailed me out. I was just had a newborn son, and I needed money, and my fellowship had ran out, and so he asked me to come on as a research assistant. I was not, you have to be an assistant editor or associate editor that had been credentialed. I didn't get my, finish my dissertation until 1976. But some of the things to tell you about John is that I think he has to be one of the most hardest working, focused individuals I've ever been around. I've been around a lot of people who are very hardworking, but he had this rare gift for multitasking. He didn't work on one book, maybe two or three books at the same time. And remarkably, he pulled them off. I don't know how much sleep he got at night. He seemed to be in the office from before sunrise, and he left well into nighttime. The people, I'm really actually the only survivor standing. My other colleagues have at the time have well, no, Judy Seville is still living, and her health is not great. And but the first associated was Peter Ripley, who John got to know while they were working together on their dissertations, and they would have coffee in the canteen of the National Archives. And so they hit it off so well that John asked Pete to come up from Choppy, Florida, because he was at Florida State, and to sign on to this project. And the two of them were the ones who really set it up. But John had the image and vision of how to do that. And Jack put a question to me that I couldn't answer, but I was able to reach Pete, who's in assisted living now, and that is, why did they start with the speeches and not the letters or the editorials? And quite frankly, John's answer was to Pete was, well, if you gave him the letters first, the funding would dry up. So there was a tactical, strategic decision that he made on this, and that's another thing about him. He was very politically savvy. He knew how to kind of work both sides of the street. And at the time, university in the late '60s and early '70s, and there was if you're an African American, I suspect, and I know, you could be feeling pretty doggone self-conscious in this very precious community. And but he knew how to manage that in a way that put everybody at ease. He had this incredible the way to engage with people, and right away he was interested in what you had to say. So he had this remarkable gift, in addition to a first-class set of brains and a kind of a energizer bunny kind of reservoir of energy. My memory of him is, you would see him be walking across the campus with this long yellow foolscap pad of paper that he would be looking off in the middle distance. You could tell him he's lost in thought. And the next thing you know, he wouldn't be in the office all the time. He would usually go to a place around the corner called Naples Pizza on Wall Street, not the Wall Street of where the Bulls and Bears run, but the right little alleyway. It runs by the Yale Law School and then comes down past where we were. And it was not just a pizzeria, but it was a kind of a coffee shop that a lot of people hung out at. And he'd do most of his work in that place. He would be, putting away urns of coffee and, chain smoking cigarettes, because he would maybe take a couple of puffs out of a cigarette and then smash it out. And all the while, he put together a team, and he envisioned how this was going to go. He would send us to the library, and he knew whatever we were going to do, we were going to need a lot of annotation for people who are obscure. And where are you going to find those annotations? But is in the African American and abolitionist newspapers of the day. So we were told to kind of dragnet all these papers, bring little 3x5 cards, and take biographical information and the citation, the bibliographical information, and then we put them in a big, nothing was digitized, and we had them in a big file cabinet. And that was what we used to annotate these speeches or, newspaper stories or letters, what have you. And so we spent a lot of time doing that kind of work. My job, and this was kind of a career-changing and mind-bending job for me. He set me out to synopsize all the editorials in the North Star, the Frederick Douglass Papers, the Frederick Douglass Weekly, and write a paragraph or two, if I thought these were worth pursuing, and then that would be the guide that you could rely on to go in and see which editorials they might want to call for publication. And I must have spent 2 years doing that. And I felt at times as though it was almost channeling Douglass. I do think he probably had a big imprint on how I kind of write. I mean, I find myself in my scholarly writing often using sort of 19th century vernacularisms, things that he would say that I remember one was something about we should put a little milk of Saint-Domingue in the morning coffee of Southern slaveholders and things like that. Or this wasn't the entertainment I thought I was invited to. And it was just, he had a wonderful way of it was almost a mix of, William Dean's Howe and Mark Twain. I don't know if that registers with you, but it certainly registered with me. And it was a voice that had that kind of that hint of Southern humor. Albert Baldwin Longstreet, for example, these great Southern humorists, and he had that. He had picked that up. He just hoovered everything up. And I think we remember him as a great orator, a great moral prophet. But I do believe that he was also a great man of 19th century letters. I think when you look at the corpus of his works, not just his autobiographies, but all these editorials and his speeches, they're just magnificent. If I overstepped my time, I don't know where I am on time wise. I mean, I'm not sure what more I have to add. And talk about some of the personalities that passed through. And one thing I'll tell you, I should point out that Yale at this time was just now integrating, and first affirmative action cases were there. Like Clarence Thomas was there at the same time. I didn't know him. Henry Louis Gates was he was the administrative assistant for the first Afro-American Studies program at Yale, and he would be there every morning at Naples around the corner, kind of holding court. And we would all show up there, a bunch of us, and you never knew who Skip was going to have there that day. It might be Toni Morrison, it might be Amira Baraka, it might be Ed Bradley. I mean, it was just kind of incredible to watch him, even at that time, sort of built his Rolodex. I mean, he's another kind of quite, interesting and impressive people that were around. So it was exhilarating to be into that, especially for me as a white guy, to be in that milieu. And I treasure those experiences, and I think it helped made me a better historian.
Well, thank you, Larry. I think you've already given us a wonderful implied set of chronological bookmarks mentioning Clarence Thomas at Yale Law School in the 70s, and here we are a week after the legal termination of affirmative action in the U.S. This, of course, spans the life period as well of the Frederick Douglass Papers to date. I said in my introduction, 50 years to the present day, but the present day may be very different in another week or 2 weeks. Douglass lives, but he lives on terrain that seems to be constantly shifting. Well, let me ask our fellow panelists if they'd like to jump in.
Larry, I have some sad news to share with you. I went on the internet yesterday and discovered that Naples Pizza closed in 2020, a victim of COVID.
Or probably a lot of places
during that.
Yeah.
I
think it was one of these places
I would love one of those booths. They could have sold them for a fortune. So
Yeah,
much
they
history.
were all carved with Yale initials and so on, and
Yes.
it was kind of, still kind of reeked of stale smoke.
Yeah.
But it's sort of where a lot of work got done, to tell you the truth. And then we kind of juice up for the day, and then we head to the library, and
Yeah.
then kind of circle back at the end of the day.
Yeah.
There was a lot of
Caffeine
wonderful people we worked with. I mean, Julie Seville and Clarence Moore.
Clarence.
And some of a lot of those black law students and black undergraduates are very, still around, and they went to Yale Law School, they went to Oxford, and it's quite an impressive group.
Yeah.
Some of the ones you say they were affirmative action, it was like they were often heads and shoulders above a lot of the white students, in my estimation. Really sharp.
We have a question that I think extends this little conversation in an interesting way. You're being asked to speak to the involvement and/or the contributions of Benjamin Quarles and also Dixon Preston to the founding years of the Frederick Douglass Papers. I know from my research that you've had correspondence with Dixon Preston. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Well, he's one of the guys who showed up. Was a journalist and professional writer from Talbot County. So he got interested in writing about Douglass, and he wrote, I think, a really smart book about young Frederick Douglass. I got to know him, and he came out to dinner at our house when we were up in New Haven, and he was a interesting man. I did hear later on that there was his wife was a bit squirrely, but that's neither here nor there. Benjamin Quarles also showed up, and I got to tell you, you talk about a man of great dignity and achievement. I mean, his book, I think, still stands as one of the best biographies of Frederick Douglass. I mean, we've got David Blight's wonderful magisterial work, but there are a lot of people are standing on the shoulders of Benjamin Quarles, and he was just tickled pink. He came up from Morgan State, and I was in awe, but he was like, kind of felt, well, gee, this is really something to see. This kind of this citadel of great white privilege taking seriously the work of Frederick Douglass and his own work, and it was really moving to see how I was kind of stunned, because I was more in awe of him. I think he was in awe of the situation. But he was a great historian, and I know I plundered his book many times from the work I was doing for the Douglass Papers, and we all did.
Yeah, me too.
I think we should clarify who Benjamin Quarles was. He was one of the leading African Americanist historians of the middle decades of the 20th century. He taught at Morgan State University in Baltimore. He played a fundamental role in giving agency, or rather giving back agency, to African Americans in our understanding of American and African American history. Right. All of which makes his interesting connection to what the project was doing, I think, all the more interesting.
Well, he was a descendant really of Carter G. Woodson, and of course, probably a contemporary, maybe not a contemporary, maybe he was ahead of John Hope Franklin. But they were, I think, didn't Benjamin Quarles go to Harvard? I think he got a Harvard PhD, didn't he? Or am I mistaken about that? But he was a giant. There was no question about it. But this is a guy who was, there was just something impressive to me about his kind of quiet dignity. There wasn't a lot of show about him. He was just really somebody who was comfortable in his own skin, I mean, as a person.
It's also worth mentioning that Dixon Preston, who was a career journalist, who'd been a foreign correspondent with the Washington Post, who, like a lot of middle-class Washingtonians, retired to the eastern shore of Maryland, you might say the new old eastern shore where life never changes, but quietly in the civil rights era, it was changing, and Preston retired in Easton and took it upon himself, in effect, to bring the history of Talbot County back into the historiography of Frederick Douglass.
But it was he was there. I guess Douglas was there when they were making that transition from tobacco to wheat. And just ahead of us. But I didn't know much about Dixon's background. I mean, I knew he had been a journalist and a professional writer, but I didn't. Thanks for filling in those details.
Okay. And anything else? If not, let's move on to our second speaker. John Kaufman McKivigan joined the Douglass Papers at Yale University in 1979. Sounds like 2 years after Larry, after receiving his PhD from Ohio State. In 1994, after years of dedicated service to the project, he succeeded John Blassingame as project director and, along with his moving career, moved the Douglass Papers first to West Virginia University and then in 1998 to its present home at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. I think I'm going to skip over his voluminous activities. It's just hopeless to try to enumerate or to name many books authored and edited, many conferences organized and hosted, and many community engagement programs and projects that together have brought Frederick Douglass to a broadcast audience. I think it's fair to say that Jack has done more than any other academic of our time to bring Frederick Douglass to the world. And not least, but certainly most central among his accomplishments has been that of, and I use the term deliberately, shepherding this great project to its near conclusion. Jack?
Well, thank you, Ezra. I feel modest after that introduction. And really, all I've done is simply, follow the map that John Blassingame made for me. I mean, he really set out the direction of this project. As Larry noted, we took a different approach to editing the many different works of Douglass, the documents. Traditionally, a lot of maybe most papers of historical and literary figures adopt a chronological form of organization. May the founding fathers maybe discovered that's a problem because they still haven't gotten to the end of the lives of some of their central figure, 70, 80 years after they began. But Blassingame's strategy, and I think Larry's right, it was a political strategy, was to divide it into different series, and hopefully by holding off the correspondence, he could publish some of the other series. And so the first series, and I'll describe each of these individually, the speeches, interviews, and debates series, then the autobiography series. We did do the correspondence third. Then we had a leftover series, which for years we used to call the other series. We didn't know, it was just miscellaneous other things. But eventually we focused it on Douglass's journalism. So let me just describe a little of this and maybe reminisce a little bit. I started work at the Douglass Papers September 1st, 1979. The reason that date's significant is there was I showed up at the office that morning and there was nobody there. The door was locked. everybody on the staff had gone to Washington, D.C. for a ceremony to celebrate the publication of the first volume of the Douglass Papers, the first volume of Douglass's speeches. So I wasn't there. Eventually, somebody came by and let myself in and another guy who was starting that for the first day, a guy named David Roediger, who some of you historians may have heard of. I don't know what happened to him after that. He didn't like documentary editing that much, and he was gone by February 1980. I just stuck around, and look what happened to me, you know. So just maybe I'm glad that David moved on. We took over and finished the last 4 volumes of Douglass's speeches that had been gathered by hundreds of, work study students at Yale. They called them bursary students who went through newspapers, finding records of where Douglass spoke, the locations, if they were reported. They those 3x5 cards that Larry described, they brought back to the office. Then eventually students were sent back to photocopy all those from microfilm. Those were cut and pasted, put in notebooks, eventually filed and put in drawers. And we found more than 2,000 speeches of Frederick Douglass, way more than we could ever hope to publish. About 20% of those went into the 5-volume speech series, which finally went into the 1990s to get finished. So remember, the project started in 1973, took 6 years to bring out the first volume, but it was because so much work was devoted to searching for all the materials related to Frederick Douglass. So that was another strategy that I think that John, all the research for all the series got started early and was done simultaneously, but then he focused on publishing them one by one with the Yale University Press. After we published the speeches, by that time I had moved on to West Virginia University, but John kept me on the staff as a consultant, mainly to finish some of the work I had done with him on the volumes 4 and 5 of the speeches. And by the time that volume 5 came out, I think John had finally started to become, I can't use the word tired because I never saw him tired. But I think during the 1980s, he was involved in so much conflict with the administration of Yale University. This was the years where there's a lot of labor turmoil on the Yale campuses. Afro-American studies, as it was known then, had a lot of turmoil with the administration of the university. John with the history department. I just think he was glad to lay at least one burden down or pass it along to me, and I took over editing the autobiography series. Now, John had already written the introductions for these autobiographies, but he's unfortunately he dies in the year 2000 before this series was done. I was lucky. We had a former staff member named Peter Hinks who came on board and helped finish the correspondence, the autobiography introductions that John had started, and then helped write the 3rd introduction along with another staff member, and we brought together these 3 autobiographies that Douglass had written. Now, I should tell you a story about that because it connects to Naples Pizza. One afternoon, Blaskin invited me and other staff editors, Jason Silverman, Richard Carlson, who were working with me, to meet with Skip Gates and John in Naples around the table. And Skip Gates tried to educate us on what critical editing was, meaning what literary editors do. And I had no idea, to be honest. I'm a historian, and that was my background. And I don't know how much John knew about what was going to be involved, because as I've described it elsewhere, this was our Vietnam. We were wading into Big Muddy, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper. The The three autobiographies of Douglass, as you know, got longer and longer and longer. And the last autobiography of Douglass, The Life and Times, there was so much material available that literary scholars are interested in. We had pretext, we had different authoritative editions, we had so much correspondence between Douglass and the publishers and complaints that Douglass made about those volumes that had to go into literary apparatus that Life and Times drug on for years. By this time, John sadly was dead. We brought in two eminent literary scholars, Joe McElworth and Jess Chrysler, to help out the project staff. And we eventually got it done, but it took so long. Well, these guys were working on the text. I wrote all the annotation for Life and Times, and it's such a big book that eventually we had to publish the annotation for Life and Times as a separate book. So it's a volume of two books, one with the text and the literary apparatus, and the second one with the historical apparatus. And so it took forever. I'm not complaining. It was an excellent work and really did some path-breaking scholarship on Life and Times, because McElworth and Chrysler kind of restored the language of Life and Times to what Douglass desired. I know I'm going over time. I just apologize, and I can't turn off my timer here. But while it was taking so long that I was worried about funding, so I went and we did the first volume of correspondence just to keep the funding stream open, because there were complaints coming from the grant agencies. When are we going to get this next volume of the autobiography series done? So that's why we started to publish things out of order. All right, we're still publishing the correspondence series because we found so many letters to and from Douglass. That was another fateful decision. I don't know if anybody realized, by publishing the letters to Douglass, it meant, one, we had hundreds of correspondence handwriting that we had to decipher. And Ezra's read many of these letters and knows how difficult some of these people. Garrett Smith, for example, trying to read Garrett Smith's letters. I don't know. I hope AI will solve that problem. I still don't know what Garrett Smith is saying sometimes. I think he invented shorthand while he was doing it. Douglass actually wrote, I'm reading this letter from you, and perspiration is coming to my forehead and tears are welling up in my eyes, trying to read what you're telling me, because they had a very close and important working relationship. So we're still in the process of doing the correspondence series, but we're making good progress. Volume 4 is in press. We only have volume 5 to do, which we thought we were going to finish in 4 for a while there. And then we realized how much diplomatic correspondence. Douglass is the ambassador of the United States to Haiti, and the Foreign Service records are meticulously kept and are very fascinating. The Mole St. Nicholas dispute, and the Douglas's behind the scenes dispute with Secretary of State Blaine. There's all sorts of interesting insights there, I think, make this a fascinating volume. Now, the last of the series, which one it's going to be a 2-volume series, but not really. This is the journalism series. What we did is we published first Douglass's journalism in periodicals that he did not himself own. He published in The Liberator, anti-slavery newspapers. Later on, he published in national publications, the New York Independent, North American Review, Century Magazine, Scribner's, all the famous late 19th century periodicals sought out Douglass as a journalist. he wrote for encyclopedias, Encyclopedia Britannica, an article on slavery. It's fascinating. Real research involved in that, not just autobiographical reminiscences, but real research went into that work. We also decided, since it was a kind of a miscellaneous series to start with, we published The Heroic Slave, which I had already worked with Robert Levine and John Stouffer to bring out a paperback edition of this work. But I had learned from watching the people working on Life and Times how to do the literary apparatus for Heroic Slave. So I wanted to tack that into the series 4. So we did that, but that left Douglas's editorials, and so that's going to be the sorry, Larry, this is going to be the very final volume of this project, and it's based heavily on your own work, because we looked at the ratings that and I also see John scribbling on these things, his own personal evaluations of some of these editorials. And so that's what we used to pick 120 of Douglas's editorials out of over 4,000 that appeared in his 4 periodicals over the years. And so, I hope we get it out soon. It's in the pipeline. It'll be the last volume. We've got one other big, I don't know, big.
Well, I hope I have enough ticks left to see it.
Yeah, that's what we're both getting old. My goal is to get the series done before the next 50th comes around, meaning my 50th. Remember, I started the project in 1979. I want to finish it by 2029, maybe 30 soon, if it takes 6 years. But that's my goal. I hope we'll have the last volume of the Yale edition, and Yale stuck with us. They have stonemasons chiseling the volumes out, because the pace is not as fast as some of modern presses work, but they're beautiful volumes. They certainly are. When they get done, we get a tremendous in-house support at Yale from the people who have worked there over the years. I've worked with 6 different series editors, now more production editors. They've helped us. When we did the literary editions, Noel Polk really helped us get through those first 2 editions for the narrative and My Bondage and My Freedom. But eventually, like I said, Life and Times got so big, we had to bring in outsiders who joined the staff, Chrysler and McElrath, who pulled that volume through. So if you haven't guessed now, the Douglass Papers is the product of hundreds of people working on this, from undergraduates to people who've worked as assistant associate editors for a few years, moved on with their career. The staff at Yale Press, scholars who have come through the office, like Ezra's been and worked in our office, and frequently, I hate to interrupt you, he'd say, but this is a really interesting letter, and if you haven't selected this, I really think you should give it some serious thought. And we usually end up saying, yes, you're right. I don't know how we missed it, but it's going into volume 4 or volume 5. So, and over the years, it's people like that who have helped this project, that have really brought it to, I won't use all the accolades that Ezra was throwing at us, but I hope it's that good. I want it to be that good. And if it is, it's due to so many people's work that we could just use the rest of the time for me rolling the credits of all, the gaffers, the best boys, all the people who have helped us over the years, the caterers. We're grateful to all of you. I'm done.
Well, Jack, I tremendously appreciate the cast of characters that you've named. An edition like this is a major slice of our national being. So many people have contributed in so many different ways over now so many years. And I might add, presumably the American taxpayer, because somebody was paying for this, has been paying for this for 50 years, has pitched in. It is a great national monument.
Yeah.
And I think
they ask us to thank them in each volume,
Well, I don't want to. I think you deserve a huge shout out, because without your steady hand at the helm, this could have easily imploded, Jack. I mean, there's so many pieces, so many moving pieces, dealing with the funding, trying to find the people who. I had no idea about the literary critical apparatus you have to start to build around these autobiographical volumes. But it was often a constant search for new newspapers. Even when I was working on those editorials, John was going through. This is nothing. We're just going through there must have been a newspaper about rare books and newspapers that would be for sale, and he would go through it and scavenge them and say, okay, we got to buy this, this, and this. And so we kept getting these microfilms in with parts of the missing parts of the North Star, missing parts of the Frederick Douglass paper, and we were constantly then going backfilling and trying to fill the holes in that search to build out his journalistic career. But I mean, again, when I'm listening to what you have done, this is truly heroic. I mean, it's you work like a Trojan on this, because I just don't see how. And you are pulling it together. Yeah. You are pulling it together, and had you not stepped in at that time when John's health really went bad, this would have ended.
Yeah,
no question. This would have ended.
I literally never found anything better to do.
Well, we're fortunate that you didn't.
Well, I'm just a lucky person that it came to me.
We are too.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe it's time for a little historical jump. And let me preface my introduction to Sue and the electronic age by mentioning a couple of other things that were happening in the world of academia at Yale University during the 1970s. In addition to the major Afro-American program at Yale and at other universities, not to mention the civil rights era and all the changes it brought to American society. In the world of academia, I can think of two major developments in the 70s that, and I say this as a literary scholar, that relate to this project. One was, in a manner of speaking, the birth of autobiographical studies. It was in the 1970s that literary scholars turned toward the uses of the first person to the genre of autobiography. And what better model for much of what they were talking about was there than Frederick Douglass? Once wasn't good enough, twice wasn't good enough, took 3 times for Douglass to tell his life story. That was one major development. Another was what was called reader reception theory. That is the idea, strange as it may seem today in an era of social media, that the reader mattered, that it wasn't just authors speaking, authors pronouncing from on high, but it was a dynamic between author and reader. And as I think about the 50 years of this project, we have one of the most remarkable instances in which the interplay between a great mind, a great figure, a great writer, and an ever-spreading audience has taken place. And that, by way of transition, leads to my introduction to our third speaker and our final speaker today, Sue Perdue, who is director of Purdue Digital Studies a consulting firm assisting with digital editions. Sue has been a documentary editor for more than 30 years and has worked on a number of founding era projects. In 2016, she began working with the Douglass Papers to help build the emergent Frederick Douglass digital edition. Sue, I hope, will tell us about this great critical leap from the world of print mediacy to the world of the spreading world of electronic mediacy. Sue?
Thank you, Ezra. Can you all hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. Thanks, Ezra, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Larry and Jack, for being on this panel and for allowing me to join with you. I'm really honored to be part of this project. And as a matter of fact, I began even earlier than 2016, Ezra. I began in 2014 consulting with the editors in a very modest way. And I should say that for everyone listening this afternoon, what's clear is that all documentary editing projects have a very long arc to them. This one's no exception. And we could even say that describes the advent of the digital edition. It has had a long arc. And I think that's worked well for us. It's never a good idea to make hasty decisions on any editorial processes. And that's true for digital content as well as print. So as I say, we started in 2014 with really modest goals to digitize the speeches volumes 1 through 5, which were increasingly hard to find. In my work consulting with the project, I was barely able to find copies of each of the 5 volumes in my university library. They're impossible to buy at this point, and the rarity of these volumes was really a critical problem. So as I say, we started with the idea of just recreating the volumes in a PDF format on a website. And we joined those with Correspondence One. We didn't really have the wherewithal to build a website. I'm not a web designer. I'm a consultant and have a lot of experience with digital editing, but I didn't ever profess to build this site for the project. We knew that we needed to have software as a service, as they say, a platform that was ready-made where we could essentially kind of drop the contents. So we started with the idea of a platform. We used a platform called Islandora, which is used widely by archives and libraries, less often by documentary editing projects. But it was a good start because it allowed us to get the scans of the speeches volumes situated and into a searchable environment. And that's exactly what we did in 2016. So from 2014 to 2018, we moved forward with that platform, but it was not the ideal platform. It was technically challenging for us to add new documents. The editors would have had to use XML, which is an encoding language that is not for the faint of heart. The editors are used to working in Word, as most are, and expecting people to shift midstream in their work to a new platform to allow the digital editing just wasn't reasonable. And that's a big part of my role, was to not interfere with the ongoing print publication, because Jack and Jeff Duvall, his colleague, along with the other contributing editors, have such an amazingly good track record of publication. I did not want to derail that in any way. So my work has really gone on alongside of their work, and a bit more about how that's changed over time. But as I said, Islandora was difficult to use. It was a kind of a static user experience. It wasn't all that great. We realized we needed to shift gears. So in 2019, we came up with a 3-year plan to transition to a different platform. The reason why it took 3 years is we really had to spread it out, the costs of that transition, over a 3-year period, because Jack's project, as you all know, is funded through federal funds, and every year you have to go back to the well, get an additional amount of money, but the amount you can actually devote to an electronic publication then takes away from your print publication. So we had to be very careful and purposeful about how we rolled that planning process out. 2019 to 2021, we made a major shift to a new platform, and that's where you'll find it today. And that's the website is, let's see, I don't think we've actually mentioned that, have we, Jack? Douglas Papers project.com.org.
Not
So
fun.
what's,
Fundraising.
sorry, what was that?
Oh, sometimes you drop the website for fundraising purposes. That's not why we're doing that.
That's right, right. We made a kind of an unusual decision, and one that from the outside looks a little strange, to use two separate platforms for the digital publication. The first that I'll mention is something called From the Page, which is a crowdsourcing platform that's widely used by libraries, archives, and other documentary editing projects. This is to leverage the power of the crowd, if you will. We put all of the content as we moved it over off the old site onto From the Page. So you can find a lot of the documents there now. That's From the Page, all one word, .com, I believe. I think that's a com extension. We have had a lot of success with volunteer transcribers, and they're working on previously unpublished documents, of which there are hundreds. So we are making a very conscious decision now to expand the objective to include all of the previously unpublished documents. And that's a significant number. In any given volume of correspondence, for example, the publication rate is 10 to 12% perhaps of the total known documents. We are now putting the unpublished documents on From the Page and relying on volunteer transcription to do the labor, because that's the biggest challenge we have. It's not just funding, it's labor. As Jack has alluded, these projects rely on significant numbers of people to do the work, and that includes transcription. So by using the volunteer labor, it gets us half of the way there. We still have work to do to clean the transcriptions up, but it's a major, major leap forward for us. And it also gives and creates a community of people who are really enthusiastic supporters, and they're able to work with primary documents, and it's a rewarding experience for them. We've had about 200 volunteer transcribers in the past year, and we have done nothing on our end to actually promote that work. So I think as we get a little more into it in the next few years, we'll cultivate and promote that part of the project much more widely and get even more people involved. The other part of the publication, and the publication platform that you see on the website, is run by something called Omeka S. That is a free open source tool that's developed by George Mason University here in Virginia. It supports other documentary editing projects, for example, the papers of Jane Addams and the Mississippi Governor's Project. And we modeled some of our workflow on the Mississippi Governor's Project. So some of the things that we're going to be seeing in this new digital edition will look very different from the print edition. As you might imagine, the print edition is limited by its real estate, so that annotations might be abbreviated, and or there's just sort of a limitation in the way that you can display things. We will include all of the annotations from the print volumes. For unpublished documents, we'll be using other features to serve as annotation, and that would be linking to other documents directly and linking to people. So one thing I want to highlight is a biographical directory. You'll recall that Larry mentioned searching for all those names early on in the project. At this point, we've culled together a list of names, people mentioned in the volumes, or people who've written or received documents, numbering about 9,000 people. in the digital edition, when it's all complete, you'll be able to search those people, read biographies about them, and then go to the letters that they wrote or received and or which they're mentioned in. So this makes this network of people suddenly real and usable, and it will also connect people across the series. I think that's the big promise of this digital edition, is the kind of breaking down the boundaries of the series and allowing users to see, for example, if Douglass mentions a speech, a link to that speech, and connecting that content together in a real way, which is really exciting to us. And on the note about the editorials, we should have by the end of the month a complete inventory of those editorials on the site. There won't be full text there, but it will be a placeholder for the eventual full text. That's all I'll say about that. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation today. And again, very appreciative of Jack and his support for my work with the project and his faith in my contributions. So thanks.
That sounds pretty substantial contribution.
Yeah, it is. One more person to thank or institution to thank would be Yale University Press. That made the decision to allow us to reproduce the legacy volumes on the internet after a certain time period. So you don't have to go to the library to find the fewer and fewer surviving copies of books brought out in the 1980s or 1990s. Now you can find all the documents in there, on our website. So thanks, Yale.
Can I ask you to repeat the address for that website? Is it douglasspapersproject.org? Is that it, or the Frederick Douglass Papers Project?
It's frederickdouglasspapersproject.com.
Oh,
sorry, I
.com,
probably
okay.
misstated that. Frederick Douglass
Okay.
Papers Project, all one word, .com.
Yeah, .com, okay. I found it, I wasn't. Thank you.
Well, Godspeed to all of you. I think it's time that we ought to send Jack and Sue back to work. There's work to be done. But this is just fantastic. It's going to be, I hope I'm not speaking cavalierly, Jack, maybe the right term for Virginia, in saying that this will be transformative for bringing Douglass to the world.
Yeah. The digital edition, it just expands breaks down the boundaries of a traditional editing project. The selectivity that editors had to use to choose what they thought was the most historically important documents, is dangerous. Because what we think today is important in 50 years, may be of secondary interest to the scholars. And there's so much in Douglass's work, his family writing, which you're familiar with, that his businesses that he ran and how he did that. There's so many ways to approach the corpus of Douglass's works that there was never any hope. And I think John realized that very early on. It had to be a very selective edition. But now that we can use the internet to, again, it's a lot of labor, but it has the potential to stop being just a work about a very important historical individual and again become social history, because all the people that Douglass interacted with, his broader family, his circle of friends, his associates, and all these different reform movements, their lives and their are going to be illuminated by their interaction with Douglass, which we will document through materials that we'll put into our digital edition website.
It's value added. The the texts are the texts, but the annotations that your crew has been doing for 50 years are astoundingly meticulous, detailed, and they're pretty damned accurate. I would report from my minuscule percentage of kind of follow-up or attempts to move beyond what your team has done. But now it sounds, Sue, would this be correct to say that we'll have links in the digital edition that will connect to other materials?
Probably materials only within the edition itself. It's potentially possible to link out to other places. One thing I didn't mention is we are also collaborating with the Library of Congress, whose project By the People is another crowdsourcing project. They, as you may know, hold the largest collection of Douglass's papers, and they're going to start a Douglass campaign next year in which they're going to feature his correspondence, which will then be able to tap into that labor as well. And what we can do on our end is link from documents on the digital edition to the original manuscript at a Library of Congress. So that would be one example where we can link out to external sources. We probably wouldn't do a lot more than that. Like you could potentially link out to other publications. And the issue there is that those links can go away. We wouldn't want to link to anything that's not of a semi-permanent nature, which I think we all feel comfortable that the Library of Congress is going to be there, and those links to their documents are reliable for the foreseeable future.
And what about the visual qualities of the edition? Will we have many of the portraits of Douglass?
That's a very good question, and one that we haven't really grappled with. We don't necessarily have copyright for all of them on the website. We have to talk about that volume by volume. Jack, I don't know if you've got some thoughts on that.
It's something we've always contemplated doing. I guess our goal for the digital edition is to make this it's not going to be the only place you go to research Frederick Douglass, but hopefully it'll be the first place you'll go. Modestly, I hope.
I think that's right.
Besides the portraits, we have research tools that have been around since Larry's day at the Douglass Papers. I think would be of value to scholars. We have a mapping project which students at IUPUI have been working on now for 6 years that we want to incorporate into maps that we'll put on to show Douglass's travels all across the United States. Fortunately, there's another collaborator, Hannah Rose Murray, has done this for Great Britain, so we don't have to repeat her work, but we're trying to do her work here in the United States to show Douglass's incredible travels across the country, speaking the great stories. I mean, you go into a town, if there wasn't a church available, he'd ring a bell, go into a field, and he would get an audience. And yes, he was prepared to give a speech to 3 people or 3,000 people. It's just a record we want to document.
Amazing. Yeah.
So yeah, I would love to see at some point in future grants, we'd have to work that into grants, and we'd have to work out issues of creating links and to some portraits. Many portraits are in the public realm, but we still would have to credit them to their original repository. It's the same problem every scholar goes through when they use illustrations in a book. It's time consuming and painful and sometimes expensive. So I won't make any promises.
Right. It's a project that's been around for 50 years. Is a project that wants always to be up to date, but in some sense can hardly ever be up to date. Times are changing, processes, especially media, seem to be accelerating. And so it sounds, judging from your remarks, Sue, that in a way you want to keep the universe of the Douglass Project intact, which makes great sense, and yet that has to be restrictive in some way. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
I think so. And wasn't he the most widely photographed man in the United States for his time? It's just the imagery goes beyond the capacity, but I think at the very least we include a list of the images for each volume. And then potentially what we can do is find where they're held and potentially link to the version of that image at the original holding museum or archive. The quality of the images in the volumes themselves are not great. They're black and white. And so reproducing those is actually not the best solution. So I think, as Jack said, it's going to be some kind of hybrid solution. And some of the images we include may not even be in the volumes. They may just be other ones we can get access to.
Yeah. And a follow-up question about how does one keep this digital edition once it's out there? It seems fully realized. How does one keep it updated and current? Are there any thoughts or plans about that?
It's a critical question and one we need to be addressing all the time. We have a host that stores the digital content and that's hosting the site. We have a consultant who does the Omeka development. I think long-term we'll be housing the site at IUPUI, and they'll be responsible for backing it up. We'll just have to be keeping up to date with updates on the software itself, which, because there are other users in the community, we're hopeful that they will be supporting it, but we have to be clear-eyed about that assumption and backing up the content in other ways all the time, and including backing up the site itself. Probably what we would end up doing is providing a static site. So it's not a live site, but it's a site that is sort of frozen at any given moment in time. And that's what people are searching. And that's easier to maintain, and it's a little more secure, I think, for the long term. But that's a question we're going to be needing to figure out in the next several weeks as we work on an NEH application, because that's a question they'll be asking.
Well, what is the annual cost of just maintaining this? Sounds like a very capacious website. Is that a funding challenge?
It's not that there's not that much content on the site right now. So we pay an annual fee of about $115 just for the space to back it up. It's very small. We pay a programmer more than that, obviously about $2,500 to $5,000 annually to update the content. And that was about what it costs to build the site itself. So this is not a hugely expensive site. That's the benefit of using the software that's built for it, because you're not building a whole site infrastructure. It's already kind of pre-built. You are just kind of populating it with your content. But that said, any system, any software can go out of service, can no longer be updated. It's always a concern for everybody. I think there's comfort in knowing that other projects are using the same system, and therefore there's a little bit of security built in there that we are talking to them and seeing how they're addressing this question. But I think having the institutional backup at IUPUI is really important here, that it's not just us sort of, relying on a single vendor.
Is it searchable? Or can I type a name in and it'll take me to a letter or what have you?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can filter your search if you prefer to look just in the correspondence. You can search both published and unpublished documents. So you can search by series, you can search by a proper name. There's advanced searching as well.
Wow, that's great.
A question for Sue and Jack. I wonder whether this is a kind of grandparental or parental question. Do you have any evidence of, or just hearsay about how the younger generation or the younger generations are taking to the project, and Sue, projections about their use of the digital edition?
I don't have any. I'm curious about the same thing. Remember the old websites used to have the user number? You would go on and click up how many people go to our website?
Yeah, I don't actually have numbers myself.
How many people read our books? You know,
Yeah,
I wish we do. If we
yeah.
I'd feel better if I knew, or maybe I wouldn't. I don't know.
Well, does Google Analytics work with this? I mean, does that allow you to track the traffic to your site? How many eyes you get on this? Like Google Analytics, right? Does that do that?
It would, assuming that the site is fully hooked up to all the analytics. We just haven't asked the developer for those numbers. We've been so focused on from the page where we actually do know what the numbers are, and we do know the level of engagement. So we haven't really looked at the final product, nor have we really done much to promote it, to be honest. We are really sort of in the early stages. So with more promotion will come greater use.
Well, anything else that you'd like to talk about?
Well, you know, one of the things you brought up early on is the continuing relevance of these documents to, you know, the public discussion. You know, Douglass is not he lived in the 19th century, but he's very much what he said is very much part of the 21st century discussion of political issues. Almost more than he was a couple decades ago, or even in recent times. Some of the questions have become more controversial. I did a workshop for K through 12 teachers in June, and we were introducing them to some of Douglass's speeches, some of which they were familiar with, like the 4th of July speech, but some of his other ones, like the Lessons of the Hour, which was an anti-lynching speech. And a couple of these teachers voiced some discomfort at whether they would be allowed to, quote, allow some of Douglass's statements in their classes. And I kind of asked back, if you're trying to balance, you know, what Douglass said with opposing viewpoints, you know, are you actually going to quote from people in favor of lynching if you're going to use Lessons of the Hour? It's a dilemma in the classroom now. I mean, Frederick Douglass is probably one of the fathers of critical race theory, and I don't apologize for that.
I gotta say, lynching for and against.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't publish the other side of that debate.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your remarks, Jack, Douglass's contribution on slavery, the standard contribution to the Encyclopedia Britannica, in the course of which Douglass repeats what I believe was common thinking among African-American intellectuals of the mid-19th century that challenged the one-boat origin story of the founding of America, namely the prototype being the Mayflower. But that's not what William Wells Brown, it's not what James McCune Smith, and it's not what Douglass said. Douglass said there were two boats. There was the Mayflower and there was the first slaver arriving in Jamestown.
Yeah.
So there we go. We go to the question of the content as well as the instruction of American history.
Yeah.
And slice it any way you want, you're going to find Frederick Douglass at the center of these kinds of controversy.
That's
I
really
think-
remarkable.
Yeah,
didn't realize
I think
that.
you're hitting that he really started the 1619 project, right?
Right. Sounds like. Well, that there was two foundings.
Yes.
There's the
And-
Mayflower, but then there's 1619.
And I found these three, they're remarkable excerpts. They're going to appear in the first page of chapter 1 of my Douglas Bailey family biography, because they go to the question of the content, the immediacy and the agency of telling the story of America. And Douglas comes up everywhere. To take another example, in Saturday's New York Times, there was an article about the recent discovery. It's probably a recent discovery by England, by Britain, by Ireland and Britain, of the complicity of the eastern coast of England in the slave trade. And switching geography a little bit, of the centrality of Manchester, the city that Douglas knew very well. And even an article of that sort, they look for a representative African-American figure, and of course, it's going to be Frederick Douglass. So
Yeah, that's a Guardian story about the Guardian.
yes, it's a story about the history of the Guardian, the progressive, and you'll find that in any number of sources, right wing, left wing, call them what you will, because the issue of race was everywhere, and somehow in that story, that narrative, Frederick Douglass is going to play a central role.
Yeah, and if you look at his speeches that I lead a project called Hoosiers Read Frederick Douglass together, and we wanted to get a selection of Douglass's opinions. We have tremendously powerful statements on women's rights that Frederick Douglass made. He went to Seneca Falls. He was there from the beginning, had some issues around the time of the 15th Amendment, but, never abandoned his support for equal right for women. So he's a champion of that cause. He wrote a great speech called Composite Nationality, which he criticized the movement to restrict immigration into the United States. The target was the Chinese coming into the United States, and Douglass said we're a better country for opening our doors to people of different backgrounds. And he was certainly fighting. The fight he made in the 1870s is still current today. He could really be quoted to effect on an issue like that today. The anti-lynching speeches kind of resonate with Black Lives Matter addresses. So yeah, the contemporary currency of his ideas is still present. Like I said earlier, maybe sadly that we're still wrestling with some of the same issues that he was promoting.
We will probably wrestle with him to the end of time, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, once this gets into the bloodstream of civilization, it seems to.
Well, look at the positive side of it, Larry. It keeps us history professors occupied.
Not really. I mean, the profession is shriveling.
That's another story.
Yeah, but we need to retool as a STEM discipline.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this been, to me, have been really, I'm really kind of gobsmacked at hearing all the ways in which this project, Jack and Sue, have spidered out. I mean, it's really remarkable, and I guess I'm not surprised to know that you keep hitting pay dirt, but that there's one Comstock load after another does kind of surprise me. And it takes not just a village, but a metropolis, I think, to to keep all this stuff together. I mean, I'm just, 50 years of this is quite a, quite an accomplishment. I was just there at the, in the larval stage, basically. But you've carried on. It's really, really remarkable. And John would be, bursting with pride. It's,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
and I think everybody who worked with the pride, I know Pete would be, and Clarence Moore and Julie and, Carla Carr, a whole host of people come through when I was there. So it's really, actually moving, to tell you the truth. I'm kind of moved to hear what you've all done.
Well, I'm delighted to be present at this conversation. It's been a wonderful conversation that has covered an enormous span of the history of our country, of our culture, of our media. We might have talked a little bit more about racial relations on another occasion, no doubt we will. But this has really been illuminating, and I'd like to thank you, Larry Powell, Jack McKivigan, and Sue Perdue for this very illuminating discussion of the Frederick Douglass Papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ezra.
Thank you, Ezra.